I'm attorney Phil Giacino, and this is Finding Common Ground here on Altice Channel 115. You can see this show every Saturday at 10 a.m. here on Altice, WLINY Studios. Got a great show planned for tonight. First segment, we're doing the show in two segments. The first segment, I have Joe Fritz, an attorney from East Islip, an old-timer who's on the show. I've known Joe for a number of years. The second segment will be Ed from Atlanta. Ed will be either Skyped in or calling in, and we're going to discuss national issues. So let's get to it. Today in the studio, I have Joe Fritz. Joe is an attorney, as I said, from East Islip. He's going to tell us a little bit about himself. I said to keep it brief.
Yes, my name is Joe Fritz. I practice law at East Islip. I'm a Brentwood native. I'm a native Long Islander, graduate of Brentwood High School, graduate of Suffolk Community College and Hofstra University, and attended and graduated from Howard University School of Law in 1970. At the time at which I started my practice, it is a totally different atmosphere. Today, the concept of technology is certainly expanded to the point where my IBM Selectric is no longer necessary.
Now, it's funny, when I started practicing, and I've been practicing probably since '89, I graduated law school. I went to the DA's office for 2 years, and then I was in private practice. And I remember back then, cell phones really hadn't come into play that much. My first one looked like a military device. And we had the phone banks, remember, over in the Dennison building?
Right.
We had the phone banks, and I had a beeper. So when somebody from my firm wanted to get a hold of me, I'd see a number come up, I'd run with my either credit card or a quarter, I'd go to the phones, and I'd make my call. Now you can't even find a payphone in the Central Islip Courthouse.
No, not at all. In fact, the ironic part about it was when I graduated from high school, they talked about the technology, and it took about 35 to 40 years for the technology to really become an important aspect of not only our own life, but also the legal process.
And think about the technology we're using now with COVID, because I must have had 30 or 40 court conferences, all Skype and telephone. If you didn't have this technology, you wouldn't be able to do anything.
Well, you're absolutely correct. I mean, I haven't taken advantage of the technology very often. However, it's very useful. But the learning curve from a person at my point in my career, it's rather arduous. At the same time, it's also, you see the advances of technology from the time at which I started my practice in 1973 until today.
Yeah, it's amazing. Like I have a great staff, because sometimes you have a link and it's a Skype link, and then you find out the courtroom in family court, you have a lot of virtual courtrooms. And then, oh, it's not part 5, it's part 6, and you got to react. And some of the attorneys that aren't as good with the technology, they get lost. And then they're calling the court, hey, I can't get on the thing, and then the clerk is good enough to send you the link, and then you hit the link. It can be daunting. Like you said, the learning curve.
The learning curve is tremendous. You know, it's just the aspect when I attended law school, you use the library. Today, you go to Toro Law School library, the books have never been cracked.
Right.
So I mean, it's good from a person, from my point of view. You don't have to worry about having pages torn out from cases which are important, because
Sure.
all lawyers of today are acclimated to using the law library, which is basically a computer.
Right. And I remember I came in, I guess, on the tail end of that, because in class, we used a library just like you did, and we didn't have any laptops. And some years later, you see a picture of a classroom or something like that, and everyone has their laptop. And they can access case law and all that. We would have to run down to the library. And I'm talking about, I graduated at Fordham Law in 1989.
Well, there you go. That's 20 years after I completed, and what the advantage.
We're still doing that.
Well, what I felt good about, because I attended law school in Washington, D.C., was there was 5 law schools within a 20-minute radius of each other. So if you had problems finding law books, you would just go to a different law library of a different law school, and you'd be able to get the cases you needed without somebody else taking the case book or the law book
Right.
from the law librry and using it and purloining it for its own use.
Or hiding it to get
hiding it,
a competitive advantage.
Exactly. Thank you, Phil. That's exactly what I was alluding to. the person hiding. You're absolutely right.
You get your mini section. You got to look up this case, and you can't find the book. What do you do? Now it's not even an issue. You just go on. Well, I started when I was working for a law firm downtown, Westlaw, Nexus or Lexus, whatever it was, and we were starting to be trained on that, and it was a pretty cool concept. It was amazing.
Yeah, it was amazing, but it was also extremely expensive, and only the large law firms could afford it.
Well, I was with a large, I wasn't paying for it.
Absolutely. Well, believe me, then you'd know you saw the bill in it. You'd say that you're talking about a tremendous law bill vis-a-vis the amount of use that it received, because it was on a per hour basis.
Well, with the big law firms, they had it. The smaller ones, you're right, they couldn't necessarily afford that, so you'd have to run down and look up a case. But I also, before I graduated from Fordham Law School, I worked in a law firm called Blue Trick, Falcone & Miller, and one of the partners was Andrew Cuomo.
Andrew Cuomo.
Governor Cuomo. He wasn't the governor at the time.
No.
But he was in the law firm. I did a lot of the closings, and then I got assigned a project one day. I did a good job, and next thing I know, the partners, it was almost like two law firms. One was the real estate division, and one was litigation. I got pulled to litigation.
Okay.
And the real estate people were like, wait a minute, where's Phil? We need him. And I'm like, hey guys, I'm being torn between two sets of partners. And Andrew was on the litigation, Governor Cuomo was on the litigation side, but I was doing the immigrant, the dime, banks that don't exist. I joke around, I say, I represented banks that no longer exist.
I'm familiar with that because I had a large real estate practice, and essentially Dime Savings Bank was a big one. I remember having to go into Manhattan at the Dime.
They were big back then. They were
a huge, incredibly looking bank. I mean, and having to go to Dime Savings Bank to do a closing. I did closings for Greenpoint Savings Bank.
I did that too. Yeah.
Another large firm. In fact, I was talking to a person who represents Greenpoint yesterday. They practice in Garden. They used to practice in Garden City, but their law firm, Greenpoint is now extinct. But the long and the short of it is, we saw a tremendous amount of changes just in the elements of banking over the last 30 years. It was tremendous. I mean,
and I want to make it clear, the banks that I represented that went out of business, I had nothing to do with that, okay? Let's get into some meaty issues and some fun issues. Now, the cancel culture that you've been seeing with statues coming down. Now, a number of years ago, it was pretty common knowledge that certain types of Confederate statues were not in vogue, and they wanted to tear them down. And I remember, I think it was 2017, if I'm not mistaken, President Trump made a comment that they're tearing these down, and next it could be George Washington or Thomas Jefferson. And I remember people in the media were saying that's not going to happen. Now, I'll tell you what I think about that, but when you see a statue, let's say Abraham Lincoln, well, they tried to tear down Abraham Lincoln. I know they damaged a few Abraham Lincoln statues. When you see young people tearing down a statue of Grant or George Washington, what do you think?
Well, it's difficult to assess because although asking should we diminish the value of a person who was president, such as Grant, I see no reason as to why a person should diminish the value of an extremely important military leader such as Grant. But I can see the diminishment of a person who was his adversary, which was Robert E. Lee.
Right.
And the reason why I could see that is because of the fact of what he stood for. Grant, while his downside was he saw every troop as passably expendable because of the fact that none of the leaders who were his predecessors were willing to take risks which he was willing to take.
That's right.
I see no reason as to why we should edify a person such as Robert E. Lee, nor should I see the person whom we should edify are those soldiers who had military installations in various parts of the South named after them, such as Pickett, Fort Benning, other individuals who were large in the the South as a result of being in the Confederacy as military leaders, to edify a person whose basically job was to kill the Americans who fought against them in an effort to end the aspect of one of the worst things which ever occurred in our history was the permission to have individuals who were slaves.
But what about a George Washington? I know he owned slaves and he got rid of them at the end of his life, but you judge people, just like Columbus to some extent. You judge a man in the time he lived. I could understand Lee fought against us, right? But what's different about it, I think, to some extent, and I don't care about Lee, to be honest with you, if that statue came down. I'm not happy the way they do it. You have a bunch of vandals coming, tearing down a statue on private property or let's say town or state property. But what about a George Washington figure where they want to tear him down? Don't they? You were a history major.
Yes, I was.
You know, what is it? Santayana said, those who forget history are condemned to repeat it.
That's correct.
We have to look at people, judge people, and a Washington or a Jefferson who had slaves, do we diminish them? Do we tear down statues?
Well, I certainly see a reason why a person would want to vilify them by tearing down their statues. I'm not particularly
You're talking about Jefferson and Washington.
Yeah, Washington at least had the courage to, after his death,
That's right.
was to free the slaves. Jefferson did not. Jefferson's paramour was one who lived until 1873.
Hemings, was it?
It was Sally Hemings, and as such, in effect, there have been areas which people have called him a bit of a pedophile because of the fact that she was extremely young and a person who essentially had very little rights of her own.
Right.
So I could understand the Me Too movement wanting to do this, and they had and anyone else wanted to do it. In fact, you know, when I visited Monticello years ago, there was a clause in his will which said any one of his relatives could be buried in his cemetery. And there was a movement afoot in the 1970s, which in effect, individuals without the advent of DNA who claimed to have been persons who were his relatives as a result of they had DNA which have proven it today that a good deal of those individuals were in effect his progeny. And as such, they had a right to be buried in a cemetery. But for the fact that even the person who was involved in the edification of the Thomas Jefferson Monticello, that at that time they did not want to recognize the fact that he in fact had a relationship with a person who bore him 7 children.
Okay. Now, with regard to statues, one of the things you can do, and I've heard them talk about it this way, is you can either have a statue commission. Now, it sounds like a lot of effort is being wasted in some of these things. People are being shot on a regular basis in Chicago and Baltimore, St. Louis, but yet take down, the president had to have almost a sense, a military force around a Lincoln statue. You saw that. I think it was the National Guard to protect a Lincoln statue. Why would somebody want to tear down the great emancipator who freed the slaves?
You know, why do people do inappropriate things? You've represented people criminally. Why do people act inappropriately?
But this is a movement. This is not just one person.
You know, movements. Look, I was in the anti-war movement in the 1960s. Movements have a life of their own sometimes, and there's not much what you and I can do about it, but say things about it. And I'm not saying and whether there's a justification, I seriously doubt it. I realize the desecration of person's property is inappropriate, but nevertheless, you know something. If you look at Jean Valjean in Les Miserables, when he was starving, he stole a loaf of bread. So so what I'm merely saying is that sometimes people act inappropriately when the circumstances fit their behavior. And
I always ask the question, what purpose does it serve? Okay, you don't like a Confederate statue, or you don't like, what does it do for, let's say, the plight of the black man? Let's say BLM is behind this. what does that do for the plight of a minority in an inner city, a particular statue that they've seen for many, many years and that existed during the Obama administration? Now, what triggered that? I know Floyd was murdered by a cop, and I'll use the word murder because obviously everyone saw it. There's no question. Might be a little
It was a
different.
lynching.
Well, that was a murder. But and nobody disagreed with that. I haven't met anybody on this planet that said it's a close call. That was a murder, the cop who killed Floyd. But why all of a sudden did that bring upon, now we got the Redskins are no longer called the Redskins. I don't know what the new name is.
Well, what's the name of St. John's basketball team?
They used to be the Redmen.
And what is it now? They changed that 20 years ago.
I don't know.
So they were ahead of their time.
Did the Orangemen in Syracuse change their name? I don't know.
I'm not.
But like, and the other thing, in fact, the next segment I wanted to talk about was changing the names of pro teams. Now, the Redskins are no longer the Redskins. They're going to pick another name. The Indians, I kind of looked at it as a different way.
What about the Atlanta Braves? What
Atlanta
have they done?
Braves, yeah. I don't know what's going to happen.
Well, let's put it this way. You know something? If that's a small price to pay for giving credence to someone else's values. You know, I think what happens is that we're hung up on the fact that we have extremely wealthy billionaires owning these professional teams who are established privilege, and they're whining because their own individuals, Kaepernick, I think Kaepernick thing was an act of bravery, and obviously it took them a few years, but it finally came around. Well, guess what? The individuals who, in effect, provide them with the monies which they make are the individuals who should have an opportunity to express themselves without being punished. And I think Kaepernick's a good example because he was a person who was ahead of his time. It took 4 years before this thing finally took place, taking the knee. Well, you know something? It's about time.
What I didn't like, look, you can be an activist, you can do what you want. I didn't think it was appropriate to kneel during the playing of the national anthem. Look, your father was a veteran, right? Was injured.
My brother was killed in Vietnam.
Right. My dad was a paratrooper, 101st Airborne Division. That, to me, is a time to pay reverence, in a sense, to the brave men and women who fought for this country for the 2 or 3 minutes that the song is played. And he had a big enough, look, I have a little show, I get it out to a few people. Kaepernick was a player in the National Football League. I mean, at the time he started kneeling, he wasn't the marquee guy that he had been, but he had a platform. When he was number one, he went to the Super Bowl, didn't he?
I don't know.
I know he certainly went, well into the playoffs. I think he went to the Super Bowl, and he could have at that point. He had a platform. It didn't have to be doing the national anthem. Now I know maybe it got more press, and that's maybe why he did it. I just didn't like the timing of when he did it. That's my opinion.
Well, I have to bring in 2 important elements. First of which was the 1968 Olympics, when you had and you had a person give the African American salute. Well, guess what? You know something? That started a movement in 1968 in the Olympics. The people of the United States was right there with it right after. It was during the riots of the 1960s. And the second one was a lot less violent, but it started to change, and that was the lawsuit started by Curt Flood, which in effect stopped the fact that the people who worked in American baseball were basically
the reserve
servitude,
clause, right.
the reserve clause, which made them basically slaves of the team which they represented. It gave them a lot of leverage.
That took a lot of guts, what he did.
And Curt Flood, he was making a tremendous salary for his years, and he gave up his career in order to do this. So sometimes it takes individuals who brave the storm to do the things in order to accomplish things which we now consider acceptable, and not only acceptable but also within the framework of what we believe. And Curt Flood was one of them, and the gentleman who the Olympic one was another one.
Right. But if you look, that was 68 Olympics, right?
68
Okay.
in Mexico City.
So here we are, and in fact, I was talking to an attorney today who's black, and he was saying he remembers a time before he was born, but he remembers when there was a black middle class that you could point to. For many, many years, that was diminishing. So if you look at the 70s and 80s, the Huxtables, I was talking about that, the Huxtables, the TV show, right? had a black middle-class family. And I saw a documentary about it, and they were trying to bring something back that a lot of people hadn't seen to that extent, with Cosby. And I
Yeah,
remember,
no.
and Cosby himself said, I want people to see the middle class, the black middle class, in terms of not speaking. I'll give you an example. The boy who played his son, I forget his name. Theo? Was it Theo?
I
Okay.
remember the show,
Right.
but
To show you,
I remember Lisa Bonet was banned from the show after she was in a movie.
yeah. But in the documentary, it showed Theo's screen test, and he came out and he was talking like a black kid, not from a middle class family, but more from the street. And when he was done, he said, and this is now Theo speaking to the camera. He said, Cosby came up to him and said, "Do you talk that way to your dad, your father?" And he said, "No." He says, "Don't ever let me hear you speak like that again." He set the tone for that show. That show is going to be about reverence to parents, things that unfortunately is not prevalent that much in many inner cities. You don't see it. I did some numbers. Do you realize that in 15 and 16, children born to single parents, single mothers, 77% for blacks, Hispanics 49, whites 37, Asians had the best, 21%. And if you look at graduation rates, it's inverse. The Asians have the highest graduation rates, the whites, Hispanics, the blacks. So when you talk about what's the problem of the inner city, I don't see it as rogue cops going around killing black men. The ones that do should be punished and serve a lot of time if they break the law. But fatherless families in the inner cities, right? You had a father, you had a mother, they took care of you, they educated you, you became an attorney. I had a good set of parents. A lot of these kids in these inner cities, they're running around without any direction. And they're no less talented than us, but look at the disadvantage they have. And it's not the cops that are causing these problems.
Well, it's rather interesting because I don't think that Bill Cosby is the role model I aspire to, because if you talk about, if you want to criticize even beforehand, and you know, you got to remember Bill Cosby's basic genre was his party records in the 1960s. You know, like Mom's Mabley. Bill Cosby was right up there with his party records, and for him to then start criticizing this gentleman who ultimately became a member of his show about how a person should behave. Ultimately, the public saw a different side of Bill Cosby, and unfortunately,
Yes, they did.
So it's kind of funny. Like we all evolve sometimes inappropropriately, sometimes appropriately.
Right.
That's why some people become leaders and others don't. But
But that
I
show
think
was
this
the
is-
most popular show at the time. It was
the
it was
Huxtables,
incredible.
I used to watch it myself. I used to watch that. I used to watch with my daughter
Right.
the one show where the dance the what do you call it, with the I can't remember the person's name. It was her sister, Felicia Rashad. Well, Debbie Allen used to have a
Fame?
Fame. Ironically enough, my daughter, when she was looking through my yearbook at Howard when I graduated, she saw that as an undergraduate Felice Rashad was graduated the same year I did.
Oh, yeah.
It was, but what I'm saying is that so you're looking at the way in which things morph. Well, Cosby morphed in the different direction, and perhaps Debbie Allen and Felicia Rashad morphed in a different way. So, I mean, you had a different way in which to see things.
Well, and the Huxtables, and you watched the show. I really didn't watch the show. I knew what it was about. But they didn't really interject race into that. It wasn't like we're a black family, you're a white family. They didn't do that.
No, they didn't. It was basically,
They were people.
Well, I think that what they were was an ideology, because there weren't that many, to the best of my knowledge, a tremendous amount of individuals whom a person could look to. I will mention this to you, and I think it's interesting to note that there was a African American physician who resided in Brentwood, and you're talking about inappropriate behavior. He was an individual who had his office in Brentwood, and he was stopped by the police officer on the Southern State Parkway and was beat up and had nothing, no reason to do so. And they discovered he was a physician, and ultimately he brought an action against the Suffolk County, the New York State Police. He won a judgment.
How long ago was this?
This was the 1970s.
Oh, okay.
It was in the 1970s. It was a big case. If you were to Google this, you'd get the name. I'd have to. I can't remember the name per se, but his office was located on Islip Avenue in Brentwood. So it was a.
And he won the case?
He won the case, but he didn't collect any money.
Why?
I believe because the state did not fund the lawsuit. I think he only got money off this guy's salary. To the best of my knowledge.
Off the police officer that beat him up? Even with qualified immunity?
I'll tell you the truth. I followed the case. And to the best of my knowledge, he did not get the millions he would have gotten for sustaining the series. I mean, he took stitches. I mean, he was in the hospital. So it wasn't something just that he was a small. And this individual was a rather prominent physician in the 1970s. So there is a history of violence even in Long Island.
Okay, but I think, and again, this show, and we're closing in toward the end of the our segment, but this show is called Finding Common Ground. And I like to be able to say, you know what, you can be to the left of me, I can be to the right of you. I wish that a lot of the issues that we're dealing with were less politicized. Think about, I did some posts, and some of it was in good fun, with Goya. AOC said, even it could be, think about it, hydroxychloroquine. If you're a conservative, you want it to work. If you were a liberal, you might not want it to work. If you're a conservative, maybe I shouldn't wear a mask. If you're a liberal, everything we do, even the statues, the naming of the teams, is so politicized nowadays.
Well,
more than I've ever seen it.
Phil, I couldn't agree more. The only thing I can bring to the attention is if you look at the person who's leading the country right now, he takes great pains of creating the era of politics in everything he says. And I was listening to his press conference just before I came to the studio today, and his press conference, he might as well wore a MAGA hat when he was talking at the press conference given today, July 16th. It was incredible. All he was doing was talk. Instead, he's supposed to, at a press conference, he's supposed to bring out things, what you're doing, as opposed to criticizing your potential adversary in November.
Let me tell you my take. I didn't see it, so I can't really comment on that. But you got to admit that when President Obama was president, the media was in love with the guy. With the exception of maybe Fox News, the media was his friend.
The media was his friend.
Donald Trump, whether it's his fault or not, the media didn't like that guy when he came down the escalator. Because I remember I was doing 103.9 FM LA News Radio and the primaries and all that. And when he came down the escalator with Melania, the media would have attacked him. I would do a show, and then I'd get back to the courthouse, and people would be like, how can you say positive things about Trump? And I said he's going to win. I predicted early on he was going to win. And people would be like, that guy can't win. And they would talk about him in negative terms. And I said, whether you like him or not, he's going to win the presidency. One of the things, very quickly, I'd like to bring up, you see a lot of people, Democrats, say President Trump can't unite the country. I agree. I don't think there's anybody alive that can unite a country that's been divided for decades, right? You think about it, even when Reagan won 49 states, look at the popular vote. It wasn't like he had, 70% to 30%. He kicked his butt in the Electoral College. I don't think, I use the example, if you're on a plane over Manhattan and your engines are taken out by a bird strike, do you want someone who's going to someone who's going to unite people, or do you want a pilot, right? Obviously, you and I see things very differently with respect to Trump, but Biden is not going to be able to unite the NRA or the Tea Party. A Republican, I don't care who it is, I don't care if Lincoln came back tomorrow, you're not going to unite BLM. BLM will never see things the way, let's say, a Republican sees it. So we have to decide, I look at what policies are going to work. That could be another show. Taxes, regulations, reparations. These are a whole bunch of politically charged issues that and I'll have you back sometime. We'll really get into
I
that.
appreciate it, Phil. I believe that I think the best we could hope to have, not only philosophically, is the ability to agree to disagree.
Right.
I mean, that would be what I consider the common ground.
I couldn't agree more. I always say, and I always look at it as, I'm a big free speech, and you see my posts.
Yes.
I'm not caustic. I don't insult people.
No,
Maybe
you
I always joke. Maybe I'll joke about Rosie O'Donnell, like Trump said. Only Rosie O'Donnell. Remember he said that at the debate when she asked him about why you're so nasty. I'm a firm believer in free speech. I gave you a forum, right?
Yes,
I have
you
no
did.
problem with people commenting. When I do a post, some people unfriend people because you disagree with me, so I'm going to unfriend you. Have your say. Don't take it. I don't make it personally. No. If I attack your policy, I don't say, Fritz is a jerk. I just say I disagree with him. Oh, by the way, you're not the attorney for Tiger King. He has the same. The attorney has the same name. Did you know that?
No.
His Tiger King's attorney. When I was looking it up, his attorney's name is Joe Fritz.
Where does he practice?
I don't know. Probably not in this state, but
I have to Google him.
Yeah. But what I'd like to do sometime, maybe a month or so after the summer, you come on and we can get into some media. I think we laid the foundation a little bit.
Absolutely.
And we can get into some of those media issues. And maybe we'll be fortunate enough to find common ground because we both love America. I think we can agree on that.
I agree on that.
And we want to see a great economy. We might disagree how to get there, but we want to see a good economy. We want to see low unemployment. We want to see this. I'd love to say when you come on the show again, that pandemic will be in the rearview mirror. I hope.
I hope so.
I'm not sure. I hope. But a little personal responsibility, no matter what the president or the governor say to us, people got to take care of themselves and take the precautions you need to keep yourself healthy.
I couldn't
that
agree
we could
more.
agree.
I couldn't agree more.
Joe, I want to thank you for coming
Thank you
on
very
the
much.
show. And you have a good night.
Thank you very much.
I'm attorney Phil Giacino, and you're back with Finding Common Ground here on Altice Channel 115. I want to thank my first guest, attorney Joe Fritz, for a spirited debate. I'm going to have him come on again. We'll talk about some more media issues. Ed Vilbig, Ed from Atlanta, is on. Let's get to it. Ed, how are you?
Well, good afternoon. Phil, I just want to let you know that President Trump on Wednesday was in Atlanta to make an announcement on road projects, and this is we needed this, basically. He came on Wednesday about 3:20. He touched down, and he was greeted by the Governor Kemp, Doug Collins, and Kelly Loeffler, who are in having a bitter fight for that position to be senator. And Trump came to the UPS hub in Hapeville, and he announced that he's making changes in the environmental review process that he thinks will cut, the permit time for big infrastructure projects from 7 to 2 years. So that's a major accomplishment. And also for here in Georgia, he said that he's going to move forward with the I-75 project, which is 77 new miles of commercial lanes.
Well,
nowhere in the country does it have this. This is going to be first in Georgia. 77 miles of truck-only lanes from Savannah all the way basically almost up to Atlanta.
Right. But now he's going to have to get some cooperation from Chuck and Nancy with regard to infrastructure.
Well, good luck with that.
That's
good
the
luck
problem.
with that. But just want to let you know what happened in Atlanta on Wednesday, and to keep your audience updated on events here in Atlanta.
Sure. Now, President Trump didn't stop by to see you personally?
No, I wish he would have. That would be good. Actually, I'm 2 miles outside of Atlanta. I live in Mableton, Georgia, but technically I'm in the Atlanta metro area, so I am in Atlanta.
Good. All right, so you'll keep us up to date on, in fact, the next show we do, maybe you can give us a little bit more information about how some of those things turned out. I know President Trump spoke the other day, and he kind of off the cuff, and he was saying that next week, which will be this coming week when this show is aired, next week he's going to talk about what he might do, the federal government might do, with respect to what's going on in some of these inner cities that are burning. It's like, you remember years ago, the Bronx is burning, and there was a whole thing about that. In New York City, Chicago, Baltimore, a lot of these cities, the local jurisdiction is not being protected by the mayor or, in a sense, the police chief who is run by the mayor. Look at New York, Ed. Crime is out of sight. It's not just because people are stealing bread and formula, like AOC said. things are pretty bad in New York City. Is it that bad in Atlanta, in the inner cities of Atlanta?
Yes, it is, and yeah, it is. And what's real interesting, on Wednesday when President Trump came, you'd think the mayor would have greeted him at the airport. She was nowhere to be found. There's a lot of people here that are not happy with her performance. She's been running around, talking about defunding the police. She's been on MSNBC. She's been on Good Morning America talking about how bad the police are. And we had an 8-year-old girl shot here and killed.
That was at the Wendy's, right?
A few nights ago here in Atlanta. That area was closed down. That was an area that was patrolled by people. Cops are not allowed in that area. And so there are some pretty upset people. And, the father of the victim said on TV, basically, where's Black Lives Matter? It doesn't matter for my daughter who was killed. So what's happening in Atlanta is the same thing that's happening in New York, which is happening in Chicago. You have a huge spike in crime, especially in shootings. Chicago now, I think it's every single weekend. The norm is 10 people dying, and nobody cares. Nobody seems to be upset about it.
Right. I think 13 or 14 people died in Chicago last week. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense. But what struck me today is the mayor is nowhere to be found. When it comes to violence in the city. And then our president comes into the other day comes into Atlanta, and she should have at least greeted him at the airport. Just because you're a different political party, you show some respect. But of course, she wasn't there. The governor was there, and the two senators from Georgia. Is
she still on Biden's short list for VP?
I don't think so, because she was really big on defunding the police, and you haven't heard much in the last few nights since the shooting in Atlanta of the 8-year-old girl, and then there was a shooting the next day. And then don't forget, which is really which I don't understand, she gets a new police chief, and the police chief comes on and says that she rushed to judgment with the evidence against Rashad Brooks, the guy that was killed here in Atlanta.
Right. Well, the DA jumped the gun even before the GBI completed their investigation.
Exactly. So the new police chief came out and basically undid what she was going on TV talking about. So I found that real interesting. And then the spike in crime in Atlanta, the National Guard protecting monuments in Atlanta, and willing to step in if there's any problems, because the Atlanta police, their hands are tied.
Right.
So
now, listen,
she has some explaining to do. So I don't think she's on that short list anymore to be vice president, actually.
Okay.
But we'll see where that goes.
Now,
people have a short memory. You know how that goes.
Sure. The GBI is the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. That's the equivalent of the FBI at the state level. They were conducting an investigation, and before they concluded their investigation, the district attorney in the county where that Wendy's is, what's the name of that county, Ed?
Fulton County.
Okay.
And our mayor is Keisha Bottoms.
The DA jumped the gun, in my opinion, and decided to charge the officers before the GBI concluded the investigation. And what was the rush? Where were these two officers going to go? Let them conclude the investigation. If the investigation said no arrest should be made, then the DA would have been in a weaker footing. That's why the DA did what he did. I didn't agree with that. Now, what I wanted to talk a little bit about before I get to Mark McCloskey, that was the St. Louis attorney that got into some hot water for protecting his own property. We were talking about this the other day when they were saying defund the police, and one of the bright, and I'm being sarcastic when I see bright ideas, was to send social workers to domestic violence incidents. Now, you know social workers, I know social workers, they got they're good people, they got a tough job to do, but they're not trained as police officers. You're never going to want to send a social worker to knock on the door after a 911 calls in saying that one spouse is being beaten up by another spouse. I'm a former prosecutor. I was in the domestic violence unit here in Suffolk County, New York. And you would never, ever even think to send a social worker. Maybe after things calm down, or maybe after the police have secured the area. Like we talked about, what if a little kid was crying? Or let's say a woman was beaten by her husband and she needed some counseling. Then you send in a social worker. But Ed, imagine sending in a social worker to handle a domestic violence case from its inception. Very bad idea.
No, Yeah, that makes absolutely no sense. However, I do see the value of a social worker. Let's say that domestic child, there's a domestic disturbance and
Right.
there's children in the house. I could see the social worker coming in after the fact, dealing with the children, dealing with the two people that are having the disturbance, and trying to see if they can work something out. But initially, the police have to go in. You can call the social workers in after that.
Right.
I don't understand how people are not. I don't think they're thinking this through. A lot of these decisions, I think it's just everybody wants to appease the protesters. So you have these cities just defunding the police, and then you're going to have a spike in crime, as you're seeing in some of these cities around the country.
Right.
And then you're going to have to go back and redo the laws. Like New York, for example, de Blasio, as far as I'm concerned, I don't know why they haven't started the impeachment process. New York City is unsafe, no doubt about it. You can look up the statistics. You know that. You live
Absolutely.
there.
Sure.
I'm flying in next week, hopefully. But I don't like the idea of riding the trains at night. I mean, I never had that feeling. I felt safe in New York, grew up there, spend a lot of time there once a month. But when I come in next week, I'm not. I feel kind of, here or there about, riding the trains at night. It's a different time because
I want to give
people. He let out all these prisoners. They're on the street,
Okay.
and now we have that's the consequence where New York is no longer safe.
I want to give a stark example of a dangerous situation. I had a client some years ago who was over in Bayshore, and it was a divorce case. I represented the wife, and she had her mother staying with her because the husband was out of his mind. One night, he drove past the house, parked down the block, comes back around to the house, goes in the back door. I don't know if it was locked or he had the key. There was no breaking in, but somehow he got into the house. He startled my client and her mother in the living room. He had taken a knife from the butcher block. He chased them out the front door. He stabbed them to death on the front lawn. Now, if a neighbor had seen this, let's say, and called the police, and a social worker shows up where this maniac is holding a butcher knife after he killed these two people, what do you think would have happened or could have happened to that social worker? Now, when that happened, there were two little boys sleeping in the bedroom, an 8-year-old and a 10-year-old. If the police would have got there and they were able to subdue that fella, or shoot him if they had to, or arrest him, whatever they had to do, and those two little boys heard or saw what happened, then a social worker, like you said, at a certain time, could have come in there to talk to those little boys because they just lost their mother, their father's going to jail, their grandmother was stabbed to death. That would have been the time for a social worker. You cannot, there's no discussion. You cannot send a social worker in on a 911 call to be the first person to go through that door. It cannot happen.
You're exactly right. And again, this is the Black Lives Matter movement scaring people, almost harassing these cities to join their cause and to defund the police. Now you're going to see the consequences all over the country, happening here in Atlanta, continuing to happen in Chicago, Seattle, Portland, goes on and on and on.
All over the
and
place.
What's interesting, all these cities, are any Republicans running them?
I don't know. And
I
even if
think
they
they're all
do, they don't have much of a chance, unfortunately, because these people
They're
keep
all
voting
run by
in
Democrats.
the same politicians
But
and Democrats.
Here's what gets me upset in New York. You guys, or not you, but people in New York, why would you reelect de Blasio for a second term?
Mind-boggling.
So it doesn't matter who, you continue to put in, even Como, continue to put in Democrats. Now, if a Democrat was doing a good job, I could see staying in. If he's middle of the road and he's helping, and the taxpayer is not getting, taxes not getting taxed to death. But Como and de Blasio have really destroyed New York City and New York.
It's true.
Real
Now-
estate value down in the South. Real estate values continue to go up in the South because so many people are moving out of New York. They don't see that up there.
One of the many ways Cuomo hurt the state is when the legislature in New York State passed the bail reform law. Bad idea. Cuomo signed it into law. So in effect, what that's doing is it's releasing people that judges would not normally release into the public. They would hold them for higher bail. Many of these guys wouldn't make the bail. Now, look, I'm not saying everybody that's charged with a crime should be held on bail. There are some crimes that not. But more violent crimes, or some that are close call, Those guys are being released into the public. They're committing more crimes. Then you add to that a defund movement, not just in New York City, but elsewhere, where you're telling the police, we're taking $1 billion in New York out of your budget. And you're telling these cops, if they make an arrest and the guy files a complaint because they roughed him up a little bit, they may go to jail or be charged. What do you think is happening to the psyche of these cops? They're like, why would I want to engage in a situation where it might cost me my life or it might cost me my job? So I'm just going to sit there with my hands in my pocket, where I saw a guy the other day on a video spray paint the courthouse in Manhattan. Now, Manhattan has some beautiful courthouses, the columns, like Greek columns. He was spray painting it, Ed, and then as he walks away slow, didn't even run, walks away, the police are on the corner. And they didn't do a darn thing. I saw another guy damage a black BLM mural. He ran away. The police didn't do a thing. That's what and it all started, Ed. Remember when de Blasio said, we're really not going to go after the guys that are jumping the turnstiles? You're sending a bad message. A bad message that, I'm going to say Cuomo, not Cuomo, obviously, Giuliani, when he said, you break a window, we're going to take you in. De Blasio's the opposite. Yeah, jump the turnstile, we'll get you Mets tickets.
You're 100% right, and de Blasio is really doing a number on the city. In New York, the other night, you had a 1-year-old kid that was killed.
Yes, I think it was in Brooklyn.
I saw the father on TV, and the father's like, babies, or the grandmother said, babies' lives don't matter. That is, I was almost crying when I saw that on TV. Right. Where is de Blasio?
Now,
they're blaming, as you said before, they're blaming it on the love on bread and not having, being bored and being in the house with.
But you know what, Ed? But you know
I don't understand.
If a felon was roughed up by a police officer, BLM would be all over that. They would mobilize like you wouldn't believe. But a 1-year-old, like you just said, or somebody, an 8-year-old in Atlanta, a little kid in Chicago, I think a 2-year-old in Chicago, their lives do not matter to BLM. Because it wasn't a police officer that did it. It was another minority that killed that kid. A stray shot or shot into the car to hit dad, and you hit the kid and you kill the kid. So what message? That's why these parents, they're crying out. They said, my kid's life mattered. Why don't they mobilize in Chicago to put an end to that violence? Because it doesn't fit the narrative, Ed. Does not fit the narrative.
You're exactly right. And I don't understand where the people should be outraged about what's going on. They should be protesting in the street. The Antifa group, where are they when all this goes on? They're not around. No. And I think as we go further on, if this continues, the spike in crime, I think you're going to see people, they're not going to say anything. Like, it's not popular. You can't say you're voting for Trump, but they're going to go in and you know what's going to happen in the voting booth. And because I think what's going to happen, people are not going to want this to continue on. And then the media basically, they downplay those type of incidents. They want to focus on other things, to boost their ratings, to make Trump look bad. Right. And I just wish that we could have the news media, for once, try to portray the news as it happens and not have to put a spin on everything. When you watch CNN and MSNBC, I'm like, these are like
they don't really cover
Joe
these.
Biden.
They don't really cover these. But I wanted to jump to another topic too. As you know, the Washington Redskins changed their name. I don't know what the new name is, but they're saying the old logo, or the logo that they had for many, many years of the Indian, they're changing the name. And other sports teams like the Indians, the Braves in your neck of the woods, they're considering doing the same thing. What is your take on what I call it, and I don't call it this, I'm just using the name that they call it, cancel culture? What do you think about a team like, well, maybe someone doesn't like birds. Maybe the Falcons should change their name. I'm being facetious, but what do you think about those name changes?
Yeah. This all started with St. John's University in New York, as you know. Remember when they used to be called the Redmen? Yep. And then they had to change the name to the Red Storm. They should have never done that. And here's the thing, I would like Redmond. I don't find that offensive. To me, that is embracing a culture.
Right.
And you can't, you're going to change everything. as you said, the Falcons and the Rams. If you don't, maybe you need to change the name Rams because somebody will be offended by that. But this started with St. John's changing their name. I was shocked when they did it. They were the Redmen for what, 100 and something years. All of a sudden, the Red Storm. What is a Red Storm? There's no such thing as a Red Storm.
Hey, I'm offended. I'm offended by the
is-
Patriots. They win too often. I'm offended by them. I don't want them to be called the Patriots.
Yeah,
anymore.
Patriots. Are they going to boycott the Patriots like they're doing with
That's true.
Goya? I mean, when I go to the supermarket, every can of Goya, I'm going to just take off the shelves.
Well, think
and I'm
about
gonna
it.
Put it in.
Think
I
about
don't
it.
need to.
Some Patriots owned slaves, right? Some Patriots owned
you
slaves.
got to take down the name.
What about Yale? Yale was a slave trader. He made his money in the slave trade. The
Gotta
guy who
change the
started
name.
Yale.
What about New York? New York.
Yeah.
You got to change the name. So where does it end? Where does cancel culture end? Does it go on and on and on? They worry about that type of stuff, but meanwhile you have, as we talked about before at length, you have crime is spiking, streets are not safe, education's a mess, and this is what we're worrying about.
Right. And I want to jump to another topic quickly. We got about 6-7 minutes. Mark McCluskey is an attorney, pretty wealthy attorney. I saw the video of his house. It's like a mansion in St. Louis, one of the suburbs of St. Louis, not the inner city of St. Louis. And he and his wife were at home, and a BLM crowd came by, and according to him, and I think it was also in the video, they were threatening to kill these two people. They were threatening to kill their dog, and from what he said in an interview, that they were saying, well, I'm going to take that room and I'm going to take that room. In other words, they were going to take over that house, a hostile takeover. He and his wife came out. He had a rifle. She had a gun. Now, in one of the videos, which I don't think was run by CNN or MSNBC, somebody in the crowd also had a rifle. They didn't fire any shots. Right? They didn't hit anybody. They didn't fire into the air. And eventually the crowd left. The other day, Ed, the police, on the order of apparently the mayor, came in, took their weapons, and now it looks like they're going to be charged with a crime, which I think is an outrage. In St. Louis, Missouri, and in many states, it's the Castle Doctrine. Do you know what that is, Ed? You've heard of the Castle Doctrine?
No, I don't.
All right. The Castle Doctrine is, in these states that allow it, Florida, or different versions of it, you are allowed to use deadly force to repel somebody in your house. So if someone breaks into your house tonight, Ed, and let's say he comes up that stairs, you can take out a gun and you can shoot him if he's coming at you in a threatening way. He doesn't have to have a gun. He doesn't have to have a knife. So when these two people went outside and they saw these people threatening them, they did not have to wait until they broached their front door. They held their ground and they said, "You're not coming in."
On screen right now is
It sounds to me like you're making this up. This is like a
I'm
nightmare
not making it up.
for that
I wish I
couple.
was.
Isn't that ridiculous, though? I mean, I know you're not making it up, but it sounds so horrific. And my blood pressure is through the roof when I hear stuff like this.
And what kind of message?
That couple,
Go ahead.
that couple, luckily, did not shoot anybody, because I know I'm hot-headed.
They
Sometimes
didn't shoot anybody, right.
if you got on my property, I might have just started shooting. If I felt my life was in danger, I give that couple a lot of credit for not shooting, because they were getting closer and closer.
They were pretty
I watched that.
yeah.
And you went on somebody else's property. You threatened to take over their house. And I don't know what is going on with the lawmakers and the politicians there. People need to stand up and defend this couple. The NRA,
you notice this is
Republicans,
happening,
Democrats, Independents.
right? But this is happening in blue areas. Think about it. It happened in Seattle, right? In Minneapolis, there were in New York. All of those are run by Democrat mayors and Democrat DAs. And everybody else there is a Democrat that runs it. So they allow. Look, do you think a Republican mayor would have allowed CHOP or Chaz to exist? I don't believe in a million years that would happen.
No, of course not. And the thing what's interesting, too, I try to keep an open mind on issues, but all these states, not states, but cities that have these tough gun laws are the most dangerous. Chicago and New York is insane gun laws.
Right. And you go to Texas, they hand them out.
Here,
they hand out guns like they hand out lacrosse sticks in Ward Melville, and you don't see the shooting the same way.
But you're allowed to protect yourself. I can't believe. I feel so sorry for that couple. And, again, you had these protesters. They wanted to destroy that house. Jealousy and using the BLM, cover to destroy, loot, and just, go nuts. It doesn't make any sense. I was watching a video of somebody sent me on Facebook where people just attacked the train. And as the train was going slowly, they were carrying off televisions and all kinds of stuff. You're breaking the law. You need to be held accountable, and you need to go to jail.
That's
but
disgusting.
In New York, with the bail reform, what do you have to do to go to jail in New York at this point?
But you know what is when there are no consequences, when you can do something and get away with it, when you can spray paint a courthouse and walk away when there are about 5 or 6 cops on the corner, what do you think the next guy who sees that is going to do? He's like, I can do whatever I want to do. I'm not going to be arrested. And if I'm arrested, I'll be out before the dark.
Perfect example is what happened in New York. They had the police officer in a chokehold, and the person hasn't been convicted yet. What are they waiting for?
And you know what? And I say this,
it's just outrageous.
And I say this in all sincerity, that cop, if a cop is being, if it's a fight to the finish in a sense, so that cop should be allowed to use whatever he has to do. He should be allowed to do whatever he has to do. If he has to use a chokehold, and they outlawed chokehold, all right? Maybe you shouldn't do it too, if the guy's not fighting you. But if that guy is trying to kill you and putting you in a chokehold is trying to kill you, if that guy is doing that, that cop he should gouge his eyes out, hit him where it'll hurt, put him in a chokehold, whatever that cop has to do to get out of there with his life. Because that man, the defendant, or not yet a defendant, but the culprit, made a decision, in my mind, to kill that cop or to injure that cop. That cop should be able to do what he has to do to survive. And it was disgusting that people in the area applauded. If I was there, I would have jumped in and helped that cop. Now, I don't know what would have happened to me, but I would have done that.
What needs to happen there, and that where those people were applauding, anytime somebody calls 911 from that radius, that area of New York, I wouldn't respond.
And I
also,
suspect that's what's going to happen.
City Police,
And it's
if I was the New York City Police, I would not give any protection to Bill de Blasio and his family. I would he would have to pay for that out of his own funds, get his own security fund. I would not use any tax dollars to provide security for Bill de Blasio and his family. I just think that's outrageous. He gets security, but 911 gets cut $1 billion.
Ed, we got it. Hold on one second.
Right now, there's the picture of the gate that they broke down for the McCluskey family.
Yeah, so they took action against that family. Ed, listen, we got to wrap it up. We got about 30 seconds left. Thanks for calling. I'll talk to you next week and come up with another good meaty topic for me, okay?
Thanks. You got my blood pressure up, New York. That's all I could say. I'm going to have to simmer down.
Now take a baby aspirin and relax, okay? You take care, Ed.
Hey, have a good night, everybody. Thanks for listening and watching.
Very quickly, I wrote a book called Divorce: A Practical Guide, chock full of information, soup to nuts, what to do before the divorce, during the divorce, after the divorce. You can get it on Amazon. It's a great read. It'll educate you before you go see an attorney. You have a great day. This is Finding Common Ground. I'm attorney Phil Giussino. Watch us every Saturday, channel 115, and YouTube. Phil Giussino is my channel. Have a good day.